The first truck came up the lane at 20 minutes to 7 on a Tuesday morning in March of 2009, and Marlene Tull heard it before she saw it. The air brakes, the downshift, the tailgate chain slapping against a steel bed. She was 51 years old, standing at the kitchen sink of a farmhouse her husband's grandfather had framed in 1911, and she watched a tandem dump truck back across the wet grass of her east field and lift its bed against a pink sky. What came off that truck was not gravel, and it was not dirt. It was oyster shell. 9 tons of it, wet and gray-white, and still smelling of the river, and it came down in one long slide with a sound she would hear 900 more times before it stopped. A dry rattle, like hail on a tin roof, like applause from a room she had not been invited into. The driver raised 2 fingers off the wheel. Marlene raised her hand back. That was the entire transaction, and it went on for the next 9 years. The arrangement had been made 3 weeks earlier in the gravel lot of the Bayside Shellfish Company down at Nanticoke, where the shucking house sat on pilings at the edge of the water and the whole building smelled of brine and steam and wet cardboard. Curtis Rowe ran the place. He had known Marlene's husband Denny for 30 years, and when she came in about buying seconds for the freezer, he asked her a question instead. Did she have ground that needed lime? She did. Denny had been dead 2 years by then, and she was holding 40 acres together on shares, corn and soybeans in the front fields, 300 laying hens in the old broiler house, and an egg route that ran to 2 restaurants and a filling station. The soil card in the kitchen drawer said the east field tested 5.2. It wanted 3 tons of lime to the acre, and lime that spring ran better than $30 a ton delivered and spread. Curtis Rowe told her oyster shell was the same calcium God put in a bag, only free, and that his boys had to haul it somewhere anyway. Spread it wherever you like, he said. No paper passed between them. They shook hands beside the ice machine. The trouble was that a lime spreader takes ground lime, and what came off the truck was whole shell, cupped and interlocked and heavy with river water. It could not be flung. It had to be crushed first, and she had nothing to crush it with. The other trouble was March. The only ground firm enough to hold a loaded truck that time of year was the flat corner where the lane met the east field. So that was where the driver dumped, and where the driver dumped once was where the driver dumped every time after. By July, the pile had its own weather. Fresh shell carries meat on it, and meat in a Maryland summer draws flies and sheets and gulls by the hundred. They stood on it all day like a congregation. The smell reached the Wheatley place a quarter-mile down the road, and Junie Wheatley called the county, and the county called Marlene, and Marlene called Curtis Rowe, who sent a man with a loader to push the pile back off the lane. He pushed it back. He also pushed it up. After that day, it was not a spill anymore. It was a hill. Her son Wes drove down from Dover that autumn, walked the corner with his hands in his pockets, and told her to get a lawyer. She got one in Salisbury, 40 minutes and $140. He asked whether she had told them they could dump. She said she had. He asked whether she had ever, in writing, told them to stop. She had not. He explained, kindly, that she would be paying him to argue against her own permission, and that a woman with 40 acres and an egg route should not spend $11,000 finding out how that came out. So, the trucks kept coming, twice most weeks, sometimes 3 times in a good run of oysters, and Marlene stopped looking at the corner the way you stop looking at a scar. Ellis Prettyman drove it most years and always waved. By 2012, the county assessor walked the property, wrote 2.5 acres down as unusable, and knocked $1,100 off her land value, which was the only money the pile ever made her for the better part of a decade. By 2014, people were giving directions by it. Turn at the Shell Mountain. Kids from the school bus called it that. There were costs the assessor never wrote down. That corner had been Denny's turning ground, and without it she ran the drill the long way every spring and left a wedge of the field short. The pile changed the way water came off the lane, so the lane washed, and in 2011 she put down 2 loads of crusher run to fix a problem the free lime had made. She stopped holding the church picnic in the side yard. In July of 2013, Wes came down without his children and would not say why, and Marlene did not ask him, because she knew perfectly well what the wind smelled like out there in July. What she did not know, because nobody knew it, was what 9 winters of rain do to a heap of oyster shell. In February of 2015, she ran out of grit. Laying hens need calcium, hard calcium they can hold in the gizzard and draw down overnight while the shell of an egg is forming, and Marlene bought crushed oyster shell in 50-pound bags at Hitch's feed store in Hebron for $10.75. The delivery truck was late, her hens were laying thin, and she was pulling 4 or 5 cracked eggs a day out of the boxes. So she took a bucket and a maul and walked out to the far end of the pile, the 2009 end, the part that had been sitting under the sky longest. The shell there was not what she expected. It had gone chalk white and light in the hand, dry as a wasp nest, with no smell at all. 6 winters of rain and frost had taken everything off it that could rot and left nothing but the mineral. She broke a bucketful on a sheet of plywood, screened it through a scrap of half-inch hardware cloth, and threw it to the hens. They went at it like it was scratch. Inside 3 weeks, the cracked eggs stopped and the shells rang when she tapped them together. She did not think business. She thought she had saved herself $40 a month. It was Dale Hitch who thought business, because Dale kept a paper ledger and noticed in April that Marlene Tull had stopped buying grit after 19 years. He asked her about it over the counter. She told him. He asked her to bring him 20 bags, and he would see what happened. They went in 9 days. Something had been building in those years that nobody in Hebron had a name for yet, which was that half the county had started keeping 4 hens in the backyard, and the people keeping them were the kind who read the label and wanted to know where a thing came from. Marlene screened 40 more bags by hand, stenciled Tull Farm cured oyster shell on the side, and sold them out of the back of a truck at the Salisbury market in a little over an hour. By the end of 2015, she had moved about $1,100 of a material that had been ruining her life since the year of the flood. Then, in October of 2016, the truck stopped. There was no call. She counted 3 weeks of Tuesdays with nothing but the lane and the gulls gone somewhere else, and on the 4th she drove down to Nanticoke herself. Curtis Rowe had retired in June. The man behind the desk was his son Wade, 34 years old, in a fleece vest with the company name on it, and he came out into the yard with her and said something that turned her stomach over. He said he had been meaning to come up and talk about the shell. He said shell was worth money now. He explained it standing beside a mountain of his own, fresh and steaming and covered in gulls. A marine contractor was paying by the bushel for shell to plant back on the bay bottom, because oyster restoration runs on shell and there was not enough of it in the world anymore. Bayside had signed with them in August. Every bushel the plant produced was spoken for. And what he wanted to know, in the friendly way men ask a thing they think they are owed, was how much of theirs was still up in her field. Marlene stood there doing arithmetic she did not like. The pile was hers by nothing but 9 years of habit, and her whole small business, 400 bags and counting, ran on an input she had never paid a cent for and had no contract to keep. Then Wade Rowe complained about his own problem, and the ground moved. The contractor had rejected his first 2 loads. Fresh shell cannot go on a reef and cannot go into a hatchery setting tank because it carries organic matter and disease risk, and it fouls the water. Shell has to season outdoors first. 6 months minimum. A year is what the hatcheries want, turned and rained on and frozen until it is clean white mineral and nothing else. Bayside sat on 2 acres at the water's edge, and Wade Rowe had nowhere on earth to put 12 months of shell while it did nothing. Marlene drove home the long way with the window down. She had it backwards, she realized, and had for 9 years. What was standing in her east field was not shell. Shell was everywhere. Every shucking house on the shore was drowning in it. What was standing in her east field was time. 9 winters of it already spent, applied to several thousand tons on ground she already owned and paid taxes on. It was the one ingredient in the whole business that no amount of money could hurry, and she had accidentally been manufacturing it since 2009. She called the Salisbury lawyer for the second time in her life. This time she asked who owned material a company had hauled onto your land, dumped, and never once asked after for 9 years. He was quiet a moment and then said that the absence of paper cut both ways, and that in his opinion it had been hers for a long time. The handshake by the ice machine had cost her a decade. It also, in the end, was the only reason nobody could take the pile away. She spent the winter of 2017 learning what she had. In March, she went to an equipment auction at Federalsburg and bought a 2-deck vibrating screen off a folded sand and gravel outfit for $4,300, hauled it home on a borrowed lowboy, and spent 6 weeks and a case of penetrating oil making it turn. A used hammer mill came out of a feed operation in Sudlersville for $2,200. A bag closer, the kind that stitches a paper tape across the top of a 50-pound woven sack, cost her $600. All in with the loader bucket she had to put on the tractor, she was under $12,000. One pile gave her 3 products. The top deck held back whole cured shell, which went out as cultch for reef work and later, by the ton, for white shell driveways and garden paths. The bottom deck caught the hen grade, roughly 2 to 4 millimeters, hard enough to sit in a gizzard and do its work. What fell through was fines, and fines were slow-release lime for tidewater gardens that had been acid since the last glacier. Selling calcium to a chicken turns out to be a regulated act. The state required her to register the grit as a commercial feed ingredient, $75 a product, with a guaranteed analysis printed on the bag and a tonnage report every quarter. She sent a sample to a laboratory in Delaware and got a number back that she framed: 95.4% calcium carbonate, lead and cadmium below detection. She put the number on the label along with the words cured 9 years, which was the only marketing she ever did. Then she drove, a pallet at a time on a flatbed, 9 feed stores the first year, 34 by 2020, from Chestertown down to Ononcock. Garden centers took the fines. In 2019, an inn over in St. Michael's bought 60 tons of whole shell for its parking court and told 2 more inns. And in the summer of 2018, a restoration biologist named Nell Farrow climbed the pile with a clipboard, dug a hole in it with her boot heel, and said it was the cleanest cured shell on the shore. That contract went out at $2.25 a bushel. By 2020, the work had a shape to it. She started the loader at first light and fed the screen deck about 4 hours, because after 4 hours, the dust was in everything she owned, and she had learned to respect it. Rosalie stitched and stacked behind her. The whole operation made a noise you could hear from the road, a steady rushing clatter of shell running over steel, and Junie Wheatley, who had called the county about the smell in 2009, stopped Marlene at the post office to tell her she had come to find the sound companionable. It was not clean going. A wet December in 2018, followed by 9 days below freezing, turned the whole windrow into one block, and feeding frozen shell bent a shaft on the screen deck. $2,700 and 11 days lost. She learned to turn the pile into long rows every October so it froze in slabs a bucket could break, which also she found cured it faster and more evenly. Her first run of bagged finds caked solid in August humidity and came back off 2 shelves, so she added a drying floor in the old broiler house and a heavier bag. She grossed about $6,000 in 2016 and $61,000 in 2019. In 2021, the year she hired Rosalie Handy 2 days a week, she grossed $214,000. In 2022, it was $268,000, and after fuel and bags and wages and the diesel for the loader, she kept a little under $100,000 of it. Denny Tull's 40 acres had never grossed a third of that in any year of his life. Wade Rowe came up the lane in March of 2023 in a white pickup, and it was the first time in 14 years that anyone from Bayside had come up that lane without a load on. He stood at the corner and looked at the mountain a long while. He offered $18 a ton for what was left, hauled at his expense. She said no. He offered $150,000 for the 2.5 acres in the corner. She said no again, and by then she understood exactly what he was buying, because it was not shell. Bayside needed a seasoning yard inside trucking distance of the plant, on ground already graded, already drained, already used for this purpose for 14 years without a complaint that had ever gone anywhere. Then he offered $425,000 for the east field and the road frontage, and told her it was more than the whole farm had been assessed at. Marlene made him a fourth offer instead. She would take his shell at $9 a ton tipping fee. She would windrow it and turn it and let it lie on her pad for 12 months. And when it came off her ground white and clean and hatchery ready, he could buy it back from her at grade. He asked if she was serious. She said the arrangement had worked well enough for 9 years, and she was only adding an invoice to it. They signed in April of 2023, 2 pages, the first piece of paper that ever passed between that farm and that shucking house. The truck still comes up the lane at 20 minutes to 7. The bed still rises, and the shell still comes off in one long white slide, and it still sounds like hail on a tin roof. The only difference is the weight ticket that rides back down the lane in the driver's hand. In the fall of 2021, Marlene pulled a soil sample from the east field, the same ground that had read 5.2 on the card in the kitchen drawer. It came back 6.8. The lime had arrived after all. It had only taken 9 years, and it had come by a road nobody standing beside that ice machine could have drawn.